Welcome to the Master Course in High-End Blocking and Staging. Over the next 6 DVDs, our goal is to develop an all-inclusive language of camera work. In this entire course, we're blocking in 3D. 3D is really the ideal environment for experimenting with camera work because it brings a level of clarity to the blocking that we could never get from live action. And without having to wrestle with diagrams or storyboards, we immediately get to see the result of every technique. The green objects are cameras. Lock cameras simply hang in the air at lens position. Tracking and craning is shown with a rig, which we'll look at on Volume 3 and 4. In the animations, we'll see all cameras that are in a scene simultaneously, although it's rare to shoot more than 1 or 2 cameras at the same time. The camera with a green field of view is the active camera. As we cut to another camera, we're seeing that camera's field of view instead. Throughout the course, we're blocking with mannequins or models. Models are not just the most patient actors to work with, they're great for blocking because they're completely expressionless. As we work with camera moves and the body language between the characters, all emotional impact must be coming from the camera work and not from the actors. By separating the camera work from the acting performances, it becomes extremely clear how we attach thoughts and feelings to the characters and how integral camera work is to creating emotions on screen. This course is an ambitious undertaking that is created with the highest goals in mind. The course is based on the assumption that real mastery comes not from knowing a few hot moves, but from having a deep understanding of every single technique. So what we'll try to do over the next 6 volumes is break down camera work into as simple components as possible and then put it all back together. The difficulty in making a course like this is that everybody knows different techniques, so in this course we'll attempt to cover literally everything there is to know about camera work from the ground up. This means that there will undoubtedly be plenty in here you already know, especially in the beginning. When that's the case, simply take it as a refresher. The course was originally intended as simply a collection of every conceivable technique that one could watch again and again to make every technique completely automatic and second nature. Often, as soon as we're on the set, confusion takes over and the blocking becomes reduced to a series of scattered cameras that we hope to stitch together in editing. In order to avoid this blindness at the last minute, we need to not only know every technique, but to know them so well that we can use them without really thinking about it. So after watching the course, it's suggested to watch it over and over, with or without sound, to hammer in techniques until they become automatic. On Volume 1 and 2, we're dealing with stationary blocking, where we'll try to do everything we can without moving the camera. On Volume 3 and 4, we work with a moving camera and develop a comprehensive language of camera moves. On Volume 5 and 6, we develop an effective blocking method that produces excellent results for the vast majority of scenes and put everything to use by staging a lot of scenes. The ultimate goal of this course is to make directing as intuitive and playful as possible, which is ironically best achieved by having extremely strong technique, far beyond what is necessary. The purpose of this course is never to create a rigid or boring set of rules that must be followed, but to get the power that comes from knowing literally every technique in depth. The underlying assumption is that you'll take everything in here and use it how you want. With that said, let's start by running down some basics. During the next number of chapters, we'll go over some basics of composing shots. Starting with shot sizes, the various sizes go by names that are meant to make them easier to communicate. The full shot includes the feet in the frame. The medium full shot is a tighter full shot that crops around the knees. The cowboy shot is framed to include a cowboy's gun, a carryover from westerns. The medium shot cuts just below the waist. After this, we have a couple of close shots. First, the medium close shot, which cuts just above the waist. And then the close shot, which cuts by the character's breast area. Above this, we have a number of close-ups. First, the wide close-up, then the full close-up, then the medium close-up, and finally the extreme close-up. Too much credit is given to these names because they aren't exact and most people don't agree on what they mean or even use the same words. And if the character needs to move, which he usually does, the terms become meaningless. So all shot sizes are sort of. Here we're sort of in a medium close. A quicker and more precise way to communicate shot sizes is to simply walk over to the character and physically show the top and bottom of where the frame should crop. When picking shot sizes, a useful convention is to avoid cropping characters at leg joints. Here we're cutting him off at the knees, which can make him look amputated. So let's crop him in the middle of the thighs. If we need to be any wider, it's better to go to a full shot because cropping him in the middle of the calf tends to make him look like he's standing in something. And the same happens when cropping at the ankles. When we have the choice, this whole area is the least forgiving place to crop and makes sense to avoid. We simply pick shot sizes based on how identified or intimate we want to be with the character. If she's deeply personal and open about her feelings, we don't want to be this wide. And if she's talking about something ordinary, we don't want to be this close unless it has very personal meaning. Being too close can feel severe if we don't know a character because intimacy takes time. In the course of a story, we start out not knowing the characters, so in the beginning we'll lean towards full shots and medium shots, moving on to closer shots. As we gradually get to know the characters, we can better accept going closer without feeling forced. We can then save extreme close-ups for late in a story where our relationship with them has become personal. Moving out from full shots, we become less and less intimate with the character. As she gets smaller in the frame with more space around her, she begins to appear lonely or insignificant. To quickly run down the basic shot types, this is a single shot. This is a 2-shot. This is a 3-shot. And so forth. An insert is a close-up on a part of the scene. A POV, or point of view, is seeing the scene from the character's perspective. The most basic dialogue setup is 2 matching over-the-shoulder shots, and 2 matching close-ups, and all 2 cameras on each character. The technical names for these pairs are internal and external reverses, because the close-ups are inside the space between the characters, and the over-the-shoulders are outside. A normal editing pattern is to cut between the external shots, and then at some point as we get deeper into the dialogue, to move in and cut between the internal shots. If we want to become less personal again, we can go back to the external shots. We can easily have different shot sizes on each character. Here we're more identified with the woman, and less with the man. If we turn that around, we're now more identified with the man, and less with the woman. Another way to control our level of identification with the characters is with our distance to the eye line. With the camera out here, we're very far away from the eye line and more detached from the dialogue. As the camera gets closer to the eye line, we become more involved. The further we are from the eye line, the more objective and impersonal the shot is. As we get closer to the eye line, we become more involved, saving rubbing against the eye line for very personal scenes. An elegant technique can be to place close-ups closer to the eye line than over the shoulders. So starting at an over the shoulder that's further away from the eye line, as we cut close, we're also moving closer to the eye line and becoming more personal. With several cameras on a character, the shot sizes need to be different enough to avoid a jump cut. Here the cameras are too similar. As we cut from the wide camera to the closer camera, we get a jolt because the shots aren't different enough. So let's make the wide shot wider. Starting in the wider shot, the cut is smooth because we understand it as a cut. Cutting from shot sizes that are very different can also be jumpy, but doesn't come across as a mistake. Starting in a very wide shot, the cut close is startling but still makes sense visually. It's fine to place cameras on a character at different angles. But as shot sizes need to be different enough, so do angles. If we're cutting to a camera at only a slightly different angle, we get the same type of jump as before. The rule of thumb is that shot sizes or angles should be at least 20% different, but that's a little on the low end. Master shots have several meanings. The first is a wide shot that records the entire scene. So we'll start the scene in the master, then cut to the external shot on the man, the internal shot on the red woman, and the external shot on the blue woman. The women walk out, and we cut back into the master as he remains alone in the room. We can place the master anywhere we want as long as we stay on the same side of the action as the other cameras. But we have potential continuity problems cutting back into a master because the actor's performance has changed during the day, which is easier to hide in closer shots. It's also a waste of film and the actor's energy to shoot masters that we're only going to use at the beginning or end. So instead of shooting long masters, which is the convention, let's treat it as simply another wide shot and concentrate on the part we know we want to use. The second meaning of a master is a camera at a right angle to a reverse shot setup. If a POV is seeing the scene in the first person, an over the shoulder would be seeing it in the second person. A right angle master is then the third person. In editing, much of what we're doing is controlling how we're identifying with the characters. It can be very useful to have a neutral camera that detaches from them both. The third meaning of a master is a carefully choreographed camera that moves through the scene as the action envelops it. In this shot from a later chapter, we push into the scene as characters and extras weave around the camera. Here we're counting on the master being the main and perhaps only coverage for the scene. Shot size comes from either the distance between us and the characters or from the focal length. Focal length, or zoom, is the angle of view. In this oversimplified drawing, light enters the lens and is projected onto a frame of 35mm film. When we zoom in, what we're really doing is moving the lens further away from the film, which narrows the angle of view. So this is called a long lens. A wide angle is created by moving the lens closer, which widens the angle of view. So this is called a short lens. If we're fairly close to the character with a short lens, we can produce the same shot size by setting up the camera further back and using a longer lens. As we cut between these two cameras, the shot size is identical, but the perspective is very different. Focal length makes an enormous difference in the relative sizes of characters or objects. Here we're in a regular over the shoulder, but as we pull back and zoom in, the perspective becomes much flatter and the characters seem to have the same size. This is called compression of space and is as fundamental a choice as shot size. In the closer shot with a wide lens, the distance between the characters is the same as the distance from the red man to the camera. But with the camera further back and a longer lens, the distance between the characters is only a fraction of the distance to the camera. So in comparison to the distance to the camera, the distance between the characters is almost nothing. The first thing focal length does is control the closeness between the characters. This is a sliding scale. If we zoom out and move closer, the characters seem further apart. If we move far back and zoom in, the characters seem closer together. Secondly, it allows us to see the world in a different way than the human eye does. If we want a shot to look like reality, we'll use a lens that has the same angle of view as the human eye, which on 35mm film is around 50mm. But we make shots much more interesting by deliberately staying away from lenses that mimic the human eye. Here we're using a 25mm lens, which creates more distance between everything in the scene and the illusion of a larger location. Here we're using a 120mm lens, which creates a tighter atmosphere and singles out the characters we're interested in. Being wider or longer than reality is the easiest way to create production value because the image becomes an interpretation instead of a recording. Thirdly, long focal lengths suppress our understanding of the layout of the scene, which can be an effective storytelling tool. Here we're using a regular lens, and it's very easy to make out the spatial relationships between the characters. Here we're further back using a 200mm lens, which flattens the perspective and makes the layout of the scene harder to understand. This either makes the situation more disorienting, or it makes us single her out in arbitrary surroundings. Disorientation is sometimes a goal because a scene loses its mystique as soon as we know the entire layout. In choosing focal lengths for normal dialogue, a regular lens tends to create too much difference in size between the characters. If we pull back and use a longer lens, the sizes of the characters even out more, and the atmosphere becomes more intimate. So the over-the-shoulder is really out here. In close-ups, a regular lens can put us uncomfortably close to the character, and it can feel like we're shooting up her nose. So we'll again make the shot slightly longer from further back, giving us a flatter perspective and a more forgiving shot. Cutting back and forth between the two versions, the difference in perspective is very clear. This puts the close-up by the blue woman's shoulder, so we'll sometimes need to cheat her position. Cutting between cameras that have very different focal lengths usually doesn't work well. As we cut from a regular lens to a long one, the mood changes very abruptly, which is more apparent in live action than on a simple 3D set. As we pan with the characters in a very tight shot with a long lens, the cut to a regular lens seems strange because we're cutting from a compressed and intimate shot to an ordinary one. The exception to this is that shorter lenses come more naturally to wider shots because we want to capture more of the scene. And longer lenses come more naturally to closer shots because our goal is to become more involved. So going from a master that might be a 30mm to get more of the scene, the cut to an 80mm close-up doesn't feel like a sudden change in focal length because it happens for a reason. It's really not necessary to go around thinking in millimeters, except to remember that 50mm is about the same as the human eye, that higher numbers are longer and lower numbers are shorter. But it's useful to notice that the angle of view skyrockets as the lens becomes shorter, so there's an enormous difference between a 20mm lens and a 10, but almost no difference between a 190mm and a 200. In this chapter, we'll look at a couple of basic framing techniques that are worth making into a habit. The first is dividing the frame in thirds. In this external shot, there's given no priority to any character, and we're spending a good portion of the frame shooting the back of the man's head. So let's divide the frame into thirds, and give 2/3 to the woman and 1/3 to the man. We'll do the same in the matching reverse. As we cut back and forth, the character in focus has the major part of the frame. In close-up or internal shots, we'll again give 2/3 of the frame to the character in focus, but instead leave 1/3 of empty space in front. As we cut back and forth between all four cameras, the framing is balanced. Dividing the frame in thirds is a carryover from paintings and is not as much a rule as a helpful guideline to create pleasing framings. Placing characters at the center looks like a vacation photo because the only goal is to get a picture of the person. Framing in thirds, or at least placing the characters off-center, is instantly more picturesque. But since we're keeping the characters off-center, let's look a little more closely at the effect of which side of the character we put the empty space on. First of all, characters seem more open or available when they have more space in front of them. If we frame her like this instead, the frame cuts off our personal space and we're not being let in. Here, the frame cuts off the man's space, so we're again not being let in. If we frame him like this instead, he might be turned away from the other character, but we're being let into his space. That's one way to look at it, but another way is to see it as if we're framing either for the shared space between the characters or for the private space behind them. Framing for the space between the characters creates intimacy. As we cut between the man and the woman, they seem normally involved with each other. If we frame for the space behind the woman, she seems to reject being part of the shared space, while the man is still part of the shared space. If we also frame him for the space behind him, they're now both rejecting being part of the shared space. Directing whether we're framing for the space inside or outside the dialogue can create very effective emotional statements. Center framing works best when a character is supposed to be head-on and own the frame. Here the man is very direct in center stage, so the most meaningful place to put him is dead center. Another good reason to place a character in the center is when he's a neutral third party. Here we're cutting between the women, and each have part of the shared space in their shot. As we cut to the man, he's equally part of both their spaces. Vertical framing for characters simply involves keeping a bit of empty space above the head. As we get closer, we'll have less space above her head than in wider shots. In close shots, it's more a matter of where to place the eyes. Here it can still work to frame in thirds, in which case we'll place her eyes on a third line. The concern is visual gravity. If we put too much space above the characters, the framing can seem too light. If we put too little space above the characters, the framing can seem too heavy. A little bit of space tends to feel at ease. Here the frame is top-heavy. By having the contents gravitate towards the bottom, we get a more relaxed and settled framing. Another factor in framing is perspective. There's lots of theory on perspective, but to make a long story short, leaning lines in the image create a sense of depth. Here the angle on the boxes causes plenty of leaning lines, both into the depth of the frame and also over on the left. If we instead move over here, we're shooting flat against the boxes, all the lines are completely horizontal, and we have no sense of depth. So shooting flat against any surface is something to avoid when we can. Lines in the image create perspective when they're moving towards a vanishing point. Here the vanishing point is inside the frame, which creates the hardest perspective. A more relaxed perspective is created by placing the vanishing point outside the frame, causing the lines to lean in that direction. So if we want to shoot a dialogue scene between these two rows of crates, this way of setting it up will give us almost no perspective. Since the cameras are not angled completely flat on the crates, we're getting a bit of perspective, but only a little bit. However, as we rotate the entire setup to get more perspective, we're running into a typical problem. One of the cameras now has more perspective, but the other one is shooting directly into the wall. In this scene, an obvious way to get perspective in both cameras is to place the characters parallel to the crates. Now we're getting perspective in both shots. Another convention from painting is that perspective lines guide the eye through the frame. Here the lines lead us towards the man. Nothing makes this clearer than placing the character dead center in the frame with all perspective lines symmetrical around him. Since photography is about forcing a three-dimensional world onto two-dimensional film, it's important that we do everything we can to retain a sense of perspective. If we take out what creates the perspective lines, we remove any sense of depth. One last consideration is where to place the horizon line, which is the ultimate vanishing point. Not all shots have a clear horizon line, so it doesn't always apply. But when there is one, the photographic convention is to place it on one of the vertical thirds, either here or here, depending on what's important in the shot. In this chapter, we'll look at the effects of camera height. It's a common notion that placing the camera lower makes a character look big or superior, and placing the camera higher makes the character look small or inferior. That's generally true, at least when we're around eye level. Placing the camera much lower, we understand it as being low, so we don't perceive him as necessarily being big, but instead perceive it as a creative choice. Shooting down on characters, we understand our higher vantage point, so it doesn't make them look small. Instead, being higher up causes us to detach from the scene. In this angle, we're completely aloof. Let's look at a couple of important considerations when choosing a camera height. The first is that if the set doesn't have a ceiling, it's very easy to shoot off the edge of the set. If we planned a shot like this, but not asked for a ceiling, it's too late to put one in. Here, one solution is to shoot it where the ceiling is not an issue, maybe closer to a wall. We're looking at this because shooting upwards can produce problems that don't show up until the last minute, so we need to plan ahead. When we're outdoors, exposure is an issue. Shooting against the sky, which is much brighter, it's very hard to get good exposure on the character. If we expose for him, the sky burns out completely. If we put more light on him to balance the exposure, he can have trouble keeping his eyes open. Here we may want to shoot it in front of something less bright or something we can control, which of course is easier to find if we stay at eye level. Secondly, we need a reference to really know that we're high or low. Here we're above eye level. As we move to waist level, the perspective change on the man himself is unremarkable, and we're actually judging our height by the position of the far wall. As soon as we put in something to cause perspective lines, we get a much clearer idea of our height. Moving back to eye level, the perspective tells us much more than the elevation itself, so the more perspective we can create, the more we get out of choosing a height. Another way to bring in a reference is with foreground. As soon as we put the woman in the foreground, our height is 10 times as clear. As we move to around eye level, the thing to notice is that the man looks virtually the same, so we're getting our height from the foreground. Here we're at waist level. It's not until we're very low that the perspective on the man himself is noticeably different. Here the foreground and the leaning lines together create very powerful perspective. One last way to judge our height is by the horizon line if we have one. If we're looking up on her, the horizon line will be lower in the frame. If we're looking down on her, the horizon line will be higher. The effect of this is that when the horizon line is above the eye, she appears submersed or suppressed. When the horizon line is below the eye, she looks freer and more in command. In choosing a camera height, eye level is naturally most like reality. But it also produces very ordinary and documentary images, so that in itself can be reason to stay away from eye level. But if we're at eye level, we're also always tilting downwards. Here we're at pure eye level, but in order to put our eyes higher in the frame, we have to tilt down a little. So seen from the side, we're shooting downwards. In order to more naturally place our eyes higher in the frame, we should be lower and more level. So let's nudge a little under eye level. In this over the shoulder, we're again at eye level angled downwards. But let's again center a little lower, placing us beneath eye level. The further we get away from the characters, the more we should gravitate towards waist level. Here again, eye level produces a very objective framing. Being lower relaxes the perspective, which creates a more filmic image and also makes more sense to a theater audience which is seated lower than the screen. Finally, it can be effective to adjust for the perspective lines that go from eye to eye and chin to chin. If we nudge a little lower, the perspective leads more elegantly from face to face. Staging upwards and downwards is really the same as staging with level characters, except that we need to make choices about camera height. We could just go ahead and shoot by the eye line as usual. This results in shooting hard down on one character and hard up on the other, which makes one character look superior and the other inferior. The completely neutral way of shooting this is to simply level each camera with the character. Leveling with the characters is more relaxed to look at and gives them equal power. But it puts us further away from the eye line and further outside the dialogue. The way to get a little bit of both is to place the camera halfway in between eye line and level. This lets us be part of the dialogue without having to do hard angles. Perhaps even more useful in close shots, it allows us to be fairly close to the eye line without making one character superior to the other. There's nothing that stops us from mixing heights. Here we're shooting hard up on the man, but we're level on the woman, so she seems relaxed and detached from the conversation, while he takes it more personally. Here we're shooting level on the man, but down on the woman and close to the eye line, so she's more directly affected, while he's more detached. Most people are familiar with the line, or the 180-degree rule, so let's look at it for the record. Simply put, once we pick a side of the action to be on, all cameras to cover that action need to be on that side. The line can be the eye line, but not necessarily. Here one character is facing away, so the eye line doesn't apply. Instead, we'll say that the line is created by attention, either between characters or between characters and objects. Honoring the line is essential to maintaining the understanding of scene geography that's created in the viewer's mind when we cut between shots, and it's a rule that it almost never works to break. So let's look at what happens if we do it wrong. We'll put one of the cameras on the other side so that we're jumping the line every time we cut. Starting in this camera, we're fine, but as we cut to the other camera, the characters are flipping positions, and we've lost all orientation. Expecting action to be covered from the same side is so ingrained for all of us that one of the only uses for jumping the line is to deliberately trick the audience. Here the woman hears someone by the door, so her attention goes in that direction, putting the line here. We'll then set up another camera on the other side to cover the man walking over. As the woman looks, we're expecting the man to be entering from the left. But as we pan with him over to the woman, finding ourselves on the other side of the line is startling. With only a couple of characters and no movement, it's easy enough to know which side of the line we're on. So let's turn up the heat to see why line management is so important. In this scene, which is not unrealistic, we have a lot of dialogue crisscrossing the scene as well as several characters moving around. First, the red man talks to the blue woman, so we'll put in 2 cameras on this side of the line. Then he talks to the red woman, so we'll put in 2 cameras here. Where in this camera as he walks to the red woman, so this camera is now on the wrong side of the line. As the man in the suit joins the conversation, the cameras we put in for that have to be on the side we're already on. Where in this camera as the red man turns his attention to the blue woman, so staying on the same side we're currently on will create an internal reverse on her. As she turns her attention to the man in the suit, this camera's still good. And these cameras just became valid again. But we can't cut to any of these cameras. As we go on, we have more and more lines to be aware of, and each line decides which cameras we can and can't cut to. As we add moving cameras to the equation, the scene can potentially become uncuttable unless we develop a keen awareness of where the line is at all times. We need to be able to solve situations like this at the snap of a finger, so we'll work quite heavily with line management on these first 2 volumes. For now, let's take a quick look at the major techniques for managing the line and then cover them later in more detail. The first important distinction is that the only problem is cutting across the line. It's fine to cross the line as long as we see it happening. There are really only 2 ways to see a line cross happening, either by moving the characters or by moving the camera. As the man walks, he takes the line with him and the line crosses us. Most character movement forces line crosses, which in turn decides where other cameras need to be, so unless the scene is extremely simple, this is something we need to deal with. The other way is by camera movement. Anytime we do a camera move, it's very likely that we cross a line in the process. Here we're simply tracking across the line. It's important to be aware of which side of the line we end up on, because it would be impossible to cut to any camera on the other side afterwards. Often both happen at the same time. As we track with a man over to a right-angle master, he causes a line cross as well as us. Or here, as the woman walks to a new mark, we help with a line cross by nudging in the other direction. An important technique that allows us to cut across the line is called hinging. In this scene, we have 2 sets of dialogue, first between the man and the blue woman, which is covered in these 2 matching reverses, and second between the man and the red woman, which is covered in these 2 reverses. We can't just cut between the cameras at random. If we're cutting dialogue between these 2 cameras, cutting to this one would cross the line. So to activate the other line, we hinge the cutting on the camera for the new dialogue that's already on our current side of the line. Now on the other line, we can cut to the reverse. To get back, we again go through the hinge camera and we're free to cut to either camera on the original line. The hinge camera is our bridge to the other line, and we need to go through it to get back and forth. Here we've been cutting between the man and the blue woman. As we cut to the hinge camera, we activate the other line, and then travel out the line to the reverse. We then go back into the hinge camera and hinge back onto the original line. A less useful but still noteworthy way of cutting across the line is to cut through a camera that's placed exactly on the line. As soon as we're directly on the line, we've lost any reference to which side we were on, so either of these cameras is a good cut. Starting to the left, we cut to the camera exactly on the line. Since we're now neutral, we can cut to any camera. A distinction that perhaps goes without saying is that we only need to manage the line within the scene. If we're on this side, and then cut away to a different scene, when we return, we're free to start on either side of the line, but then of course have to stick to that side. Besides using these techniques, the easiest way to make line management simpler is to clean up as much as possible before we even get started. The first way to do that is to filter out the characters we don't care about. As soon as the view is less cluttered, it becomes much easier to keep track of which lines we need to be concerned with, and it's usually fewer than it looked like before. The second way is to decide on a major coverage angle. If we don't do that, we'll basically have to put in cameras for every position of every line throughout the scene. Deciding to generally cover the scene in this direction increases the likelihood of a camera staying useful as the line moves around. The extreme of this is sitcom or soap opera blocking, where all cameras are outside the scene and pointed in more or less the same direction, which of course is not our goal. But first deciding on a general shooting direction is much easier to build from. Getting coverage is the process of putting in cameras for everything we're interested in or might be interested in when editing. The simplest form of coverage is to start a scene in a master to establish geography and then put in cameras for everything we know or suspect we'll need in editing. Here we're covering the characters, but we could also pick shots for the phone, for body language, or for any other part of the scene. Starting in the master, every subsequent cut is really an insert on part of the scene. As we cut between the characters, we're depending more or less on the scene geography we got from the master. If we hadn't done a master, their locations and relationships could be hard to work out. But covering a scene as inserts of a master can make a scene seem more stitched together and less fluid. Still, it's a very normal way to get coverage, though perhaps not the most interesting. The step up from this is to add 2 shots, 3 shots, and reverses to get variety and to quickly shift perspective or scale to the parts of the scene that are interesting or important at the moment. But as we start doing combinations like this, it's clear that we could easily cover the scene in 100 cameras, at the same time wearing down the actors and shooting rolls and rolls of film we'll never use. So let's look at some tools to narrow down the choices. In placing cameras for dialogue, the number of cameras we need first of all depends on the length of the scene. If the scene is long, we need more shot sizes to keep it interesting and to tell a story in editing. If it's short, we can get away with only a couple, and having lots of shot sizes can actually be distracting. It's a common conception that reverse shots have to match. But this is really an unnecessary creative limitation, so let's take complete liberty in staging this scene. We'll start by leaving one external reverse intact, but placing the other one much lower. You be the judge of what it means. Perhaps that the further distance from the eye line gives us a more secret and individual angle on him, but it cuts just as well. Here we're normal on the man, but we're at a right angle on the woman, so the shot on her is further away from the eye line and more separate. Here we're again in a low angle in this reverse, and behind the man's shoulder in this reverse. The point is that getting perfect matching angles is not necessarily a big deal, and this can help us save some cameras. If we make it a goal that instead of covering every possible combination, we select fewer shots that capture more of the action, the coverage is not only more optimized, it's easier to deal with. Here we could easily cover the scene in 10 to 15 cameras. Let's instead place 4 cameras, first an internal reverse on the blue man, then an external reverse on the red woman, a shot that frames the blue man with the man in the suit, and a shot that frames the 2 women. This is extremely compact staging. The shots aren't framed ideally, quote-unquote, but there's plenty of coverage to cut a scene from, and there's more information in each shot, so the cameras stay interesting for longer. For a close-up on the red woman, we're using this shot, which serves double duty for later. To include the man in the suit, we're keeping the blue man in the foreground as well. For the blue woman's dialogue, we're using the same shot as before, keeping the red woman in the foreground. The scene cuts just as easily as if we were covering it by the book, and it might in fact be more interesting. A powerful way to select shots is by grouping characters to emphasize relationships. By grouping, we show who's together and who's not, which brings meaning to the coverage. In this scene, we're in a negotiation. The man in the suit is a businessman. The blue characters are a married couple. The red man is the attorney for the businessman. And the red woman is attorney for the couple. Since we're in a negotiation, that first of all creates 2 very clear groups made up of each team on opposite sides of the negotiating table. So let's start by framing one camera for the businessman and his attorney, and another for the couple and their attorney. Cutting between them, we show the members of each group together in that group and opposite the others. Every shot can be a different grouping of the same characters. If we want to show the couple as a unit, we'll make them into a group for this shot. If the blue woman and the attorney have a small exchange, we'll make that into a group as well. Grouping characters together shows relationship, whether it's a positive or a negative one. Let's say that during the negotiation, the businessman begins revealing a secret he knows about the blue woman. That creates a relationship here, which we'll cover in 2 over the shoulders. The blue man is disheartened to hear the truth, so let's create a shot to group him by himself. Let's create another single shot on the businessman as he enjoys his victory. Grouping to show relationships is not a law, because sometimes we just want a 3-shot if that's where the action is. But it can be a helpful and quick way to get meaningful coverage in fewer cameras. After the opening, we'll cut between the group on the couple and the group on the businessman. At some point, the blue woman consults the attorney. Meanwhile, the businessman and the blue man continue the negotiation. The blue woman comes back with a remark. The businessman then turns his attention to her and begins revealing a secret she hasn't told her husband about. We go back and forth for a while. The couple's attorney objects, but the truth is out, and we cut to the blue man as he takes it in. We cut to the businessman as he enjoys his victory. We could go on and create as many relationships as we need, maybe some bickering between the attorneys. But the important thing is that instead of having covered the scene from every conceivable angle and hoping to work out the meaning later, we've chosen the meaning going in. We don't cover everything, and we don't need to. Spatial continuity is the technical name for the understanding of the scene's layout that's created in the viewer's mind when we cut between shots. From the various cameras that make up the coverage, the viewer depends on being able to mentally stitch the scene together. Here, the 2 shots glue together and create the illusion of continuous space, with the woman to the left and the man to the right. But in this case, the choice of angles made us construct the wrong mental model of the scene. The characters are really seated back to back. So let's look at some ways to create spatial continuity. The easiest way is to start in a master. Coming from a complete overview of the scene, the geography is so clear that it almost doesn't matter what we do afterwards. We can sometimes even cross the line. That's the classic reason for starting a scene in a master, but starting in a master has some significant drawbacks which we'll look at in the next chapter. Honoring the line can by itself be enough for the spatial orientation to make sense. When we cut to different cameras on this side, it only takes a moment to deduct from our mental model where we've moved to. So let's look a little more closely at why the line works. No matter where we place cameras on this side, the red man will always be to the left and the blue woman will always be to the right. Even cutting between tied over the shoulders where our angle is changing nearly 180 degrees, the man is to the left and the woman is to the right. So the mental model is really made up of knowing what's to the left and right. The problem is that if we're suddenly on the other side of the line, the man is now to the right and the woman to the left. In the few seconds it takes us to rotate our model and figure out where we are, we're not paying attention to the story and we experience a distracting jolt. But in the first example, we were honoring the line, yet we still misunderstood the geography. The reason is that we were keeping the space in front of the characters even though they were seated back to back. We've come to automatically expect the space in the shot to be part of the shared space between the characters, and since we didn't know better, this led us to assume that they were sitting in front of each other. If we instead frame the shots like this, the space really is the shared space, and the scene makes perfect sense without any other aids. An effective way to maintain spatial continuity is to create overlapping groups. Here we'll create one shot that groups the man and the red woman, and another that groups the red man and the blue woman. When the shots we pick contain elements that are visible in other shots as well, it's very easy to mentally piece together the scene. This is called pivoting because the editing revolves around a character or an object. Here we're using the plan as a pivot, so it's visible both in this shot and in this shot. And again as we cut to the woman in the middle. So the layout of the scene is reasonably clear. Here we're pivoting on characters in the background. With reference in the first shot, it's fairly easy to deduct where we are in the second. Hopefully we concluded that the characters are staged like this. In this scene, we'll again forgo a master and first pivot around the blue man to this shot. Then pivot around the woman to this shot, and then to this shot. As we play through it again, even though we're zigzagging through the scene, the layout is clear because one character is always the common denominator. It works the same backwards. With no other references in the scene, the spatial continuity is coming directly from the pivoting. Depending on how we place the cameras, pivots behave in two very different ways that are important to recognize. When we're pivoting around an object or a character in the middle, that object will jump from side to side in the frame. Here the object is an inconspicuous plant, but if it were a large object, it could get annoying. Here we're pivoting around the character in the middle. He also jumps from side to side, but since we're clearly going between two groups, it seems to happen for a reason. When we're rotating around a character, we're more inclined to keep him in the same part of the frame. Here the blue man stays on the right side. Here the woman stays on the left side. When we have the choice, it's better to have the character stay in the same part of the frame because it takes less effort to make sense of. Returning to the discussion on hinging, a hinge is nearly always also a pivot. Starting on the first line, as we hinge onto the second line, the man stays in the same part of the frame. After having traveled out the second line, we're back in the hinge camera. As we hinge back on the first line, we again pivot around the man. On our way back, the line is here, so pivoting into this camera is technically a line cross. However, since we're pivoting on the man, the cut is smooth enough that it really doesn't matter. One of the most powerful ways to make a scene interesting is to control the order information is presented in. To do that, let's first look at the concept of open and closed framings. An open framing is a framing where we don't have everything we need to understand what we're seeing. The real story, the key information, lies outside the boundaries of the frame, and we're only seeing a small part of the bigger picture. That immediately makes us ask questions like, where are we? What are the papers scattered on the table? And whose hand is this? By suppressing that information for a short while, we pay more attention. A closed framing is self-contained. The entire story is within the frame, and we have everything we need to understand it. So if an open framing creates questions, closed framings create answers. As soon as the cat's out of the bag, we can't go back to an open framing and expect the same sense of mystery and curiosity. Everything is now just an insert. And the long, slow reveal from before has now lost most of its punch because we already know the larger whole it's part of. Anytime we can make a scene move from open framings towards closed framings, the scene as a whole becomes more interesting than if we do it the other way around, and it's a very effective habit to develop. On a slightly larger scale, the logic of open and closed framing is key to deciding the cutting order of shots in a scene. Here we're starting on a single character, and we don't know that this is an open framing until we cut to reveal another character also in the scene. A classic comical trick is to play on assumptions, as here where the man is talking about something deeply personal, so we assume that he's maybe with a therapist. Cutting to reveal him in the center of the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company completely changes the meaning. A master is usually a very closed framing, and while starting a scene in a master works wonders for establishing geography, it eliminates any visual mystery right off the bat. But we don't need masters per se, because all we want is for the internal geography between the characters to make sense, which we can easily achieve by honoring the line or by creating overlapping groups. Masters work best for scenes where we need to deliver a lot of information quickly because one glance conveys the whole situation. A master or closed framing also works great to wrap things up, for instance after we've been covering intimate dialogue in close shots. We then cut to a wide shot to close the scene. But regardless of whether or not we use this to control the order of information, open framings tend to simply be more interesting because they create the feeling of shooting a small part of a world that's much bigger. Closed framings, on the other hand, give the feeling that the world has a definite size. In this scene, we're restricted by the size of the set, and whether we're on a soundstage or on location, the edge of the set is a realistic concern. So the tendency is sometimes to just barely squeeze the action into the set and cover it in the widest possible shot to capture the whole available scene. But after a while, we begin to feel confined, as if the world ends just to the left and the right of the frame. Which is true. The slightest pan reveals the edge. This often makes a set look like a set. What we really want is the feeling of a world that extends infinitely beyond the boundaries of the frame and where we're simply capturing the part that happens to intersect. So if we resist shooting the set as a whole and we stick to more open framings, we of course don't get to see all the production design, but the characters become much more part of a real environment. But this doesn't have to exclude wide shots. We just have to make it appear that the world continues outside the frame by having the surrounding environment spill into the frame. So we'll rearrange the set or deliberately bring in things to be cropped, starting with a table, a counter in the background, some foreground, and by placing some extras over the edge of the frame, making the scene part of a limitless world. Open framings are also useful when we need to make a few characters look like a lot. Here we want to make 15 extras look like a crowd, and using a slightly wide-angle lens, the framing is about closed. With all the extras in the shot, we get the feeling we're seeing exactly 15 extras and not a crowd. If we tighten the shot, they spill over the edge, but it still feels like we're seeing the whole thing. What we should do instead is create an intensely populated shot with enough spill over the edges that we believe the environment looks the same. So we'll start by staging the characters deeper and closer together, and use a longer lens which automatically makes the frame more open, at the same time compressing the space. We then make sure to fill in any gaps around the edges so the world is infinite. With crowd sound effects added, this can be quite convincing. Finally, open and closed framings can effectively be mixed within a single shot. Here the man is waiting to talk to the woman about a serious error in some paperwork. So the framing is closed on her in the papers, but open on the man, and we don't know what state of mind he's in. As we crane up, we gradually find out. In the next number of chapters, we'll run down some simple geometric shapes to align cameras and characters by. These shapes are not goals by themselves, but they can be an aid in structuring coverage because once we spot a shape in a scene, we have a set of techniques ready to go with that shape. Placing cameras at right angles can be a useful alternative to over the shoulders when the characters are standing at angles to each other. As we cut between the cameras, each shot is a frontal view of the character in focus and a side view of the other, making each shot personal to each character. Putting the cameras out here, we're doing the same thing, but from outside the action. The side view is now the main view on each character. Whether or not to stage in right angles is a style choice, but it can be effective when characters are also arranged in right angles. This happens surprisingly often. Here the man is trying to communicate with a woman, but she's keeping to herself, so let's put in one camera for her and a right angle camera for them both. Let's do a close shot version of the last camera as well. Starting in the single shot on the woman, this layout gives us very expressive coverage to edit from. The main benefit of right angle cameras is that they very naturally isolate characters and can make shots more individual. Outward cameras are placing cameras outwards from a central point. This can be a manageable way to cover scenes that easily have many lines like this scene where the characters are sitting around a table. The philosophy is to aim all cameras out from the center, but in reality we'll be backing up most of the cameras to get a better framing. So starting with a shot on the man in the suit, we'll put in a camera for the women and one for the men. Let's also do a camera on the blue woman and one on the blue man. Since we're staying within all lines, the coverage makes sense, at least in theory. Practically, cutting between 360 degrees of cameras can sometimes feel like we're twisting our necks. For that reason, it can be a good idea to limit the arc in editing and never cut around in a full circle. So we'll avoid cutting from this camera to this camera. Instead, we'll hinge on the man in the suit to get back and forth, as he seems to be the moderator in the scene anyway. As in choosing a major coverage angle, starting coverage outwards from a central area is a good strategy because it creates less line issues. With parallel cameras, all cameras are shooting in the same direction. This produces very two-dimensional coverage that can be a style in itself. Parallel cameras can work great on a limited set that doesn't allow a lot of freedom to pick angles. Here we really only need a back wall. But since every shot is from the same angle, spatial continuity is harder to maintain. Keeping the space consistently in front of the characters helps. We're keeping the moderator in the center, which also helps. We've additionally set up some cameras to create overlapping groups. In a scene like this, where spatial continuity is easily a problem, it can be a good idea to shoot a full master because the ability to cut back into a master at any time will be useful in editing. Character arrangements often naturally fall into shapes that resemble letters of the alphabet, like I, A, L, U, and O. It's sometimes considered a rule to actually stage characters according to these shapes, but that can sometimes seem staged. Our goal here is merely to have a library of possible camera plots ready for when we find ourselves in shapes that are close to them, which happens often. The I shape is the simplest one and has the characters arranged in a straight line. Two-character dialogue is often automatically an I shape and is easily covered in a selection of reverse shots and perhaps a master. When more characters are added to the straight line, the best approach is to think in terms of creating various groupings and pivoting on certain characters to help glue the scene together. So let's create some groups starting with a 3-shot here and a reverse 3-shot to match. Let's also create 2 over the shoulders here for dialogue between the woman and the red man. At some point the woman turns, and we'll set up 2 reverse shots for this dialogue as well. Let's also add a close-up on her. We've set up the camera so that the woman can be used as a pivot. As we cut between the closer shots, she's the common denominator between the 2 major groups. It's a matter of taste how much coverage to add. This scene is overcovered as it is. There's no formula for which groups to create because it depends on what the scene is about, but the sooner we can make the selection, the less we'll have to shoot. The shape is the same regardless of which way the characters are facing, so if we face them outwards, we should be able to use the same coverage with no change. Here we're first cutting back and forth between the reverses in the first group. We pivot on the woman as we go to the second group, and the other reverse. The I shape appears within most other shapes, so anytime we want some local coverage, we can treat that part of the scene as such. Here the 3 lined up characters are an obvious I shape, so we'll go in and create some subgroups of the parts of the conversation that we're interested in. Whether or not to deliberately stage in a shape like this is optional, but doing so makes planning shots extremely easy. Here 2 characters are together and 1 is at a distance. Still, we place them in a line to make coverage very straightforward. The A shape consists of 3 characters arranged in any kind of triangle and is a shape that appears in one form or another in the vast majority of scenes. So it's extremely useful to have camera plots at hand for it. The easiest way to cover this is as a series of reverse shots in various sizes, starting with an external reverse covering all 3, and a matching reverse here. Let's also do an internal reverse on the woman, an internal reverse 2-shot on the men, and a close-up for each of the men. For now, we're really only using 1 line, and since all the cameras are on the same side, we can cut freely between them. The only 2 cameras that don't cut well together are the close-ups on the men because they're nearly identical. We're trying to detract attention from this by having the background be different in each shot, but it's still a fairly jerky cut. Simply bridging the cut with a different shot solves it. So we're basically covering it as regular dialogue, except one side has 2 characters. But we don't have to be stuck on one side of the line. If the men are to have dialogue, we'll put in a reverse pair for that, which creates another line here. This camera is easy to get to because it's out with the other cameras, but cutting to this camera could cross any number of potential lines and we need to hinge in and out of it. Starting in the original cameras, the most logical choice is to hinge through the reverse that's already on our side of the current line. As soon as we've cut through it, going to the far camera seems logical. For getting back out, all of these cameras are technically on the right side of the new line, but since we still remember the previous line, it's better to hinge back as well. So starting in the far camera, we go back to the hinge from where we can cut to any of the original cameras. But the scene actually has some built-in hinges already. If we forget about the woman for a moment, both the internal 2-shot on the men and each of the close-ups are already in a master relationship to the second line. So if we're coming from external dialogue and we want to go to the far camera, the 2-shot could be just as useful a hinge. An issue here, though, is that in this shot, the line we're coming from is still fresh in our memory, and we'd need to wait a little as we get used to the new line before cutting to the far camera. So using the near reverse to hinge is still the better solution. With the A shape a little wider, we're likely to want to do dialogue between the central character and each of the other characters. The simplest way to get them covered is to place 3 internal cameras outward from the center, which will allow us to cut the scene in any order. But doing external reverse pairs is a little trickier. We'll first put in a pair for the red man and the woman. We're placing the pair on this side of their line so the internal cameras can work as close-ups, but also because it keeps us inside the action. If we'd put the cameras out here, we'd separate the 2 characters and the dialogue would be more private. Out here, we wouldn't be able to use the internal cameras. Let's place another reverse for the 2. The way to connect all the cameras in the scene is to use the red man's close-up as a hinge. From here, we can get to all the other cameras. We get easily into the external shot on the woman, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. We get easily into the external shot on the blue man, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. Since these 2 cameras are on the same side of both, switches sides in the frame, but since we understand it as 2 overlapping groups, it makes sense. Going between the 2 other external reverses naturally won't work. The jump across 2 lines is very But let's go ahead and look at what happens if we place one of the reverse. So this camera is the only choice for a hinge. From the hinge, let's look at the 2 only cutting options, starting with this one. We'll then be pivoting on the red man to the similar reverse on the woman. He stays in the same part of the frame, and the 2 other characters simply replace each other. Look different enough, so let's bring in some background. Shots are so is a smoother cut, but causes us to leap around more, which can sometimes be startling as line. There's no preference, and it's a choice we can make in editing. Our only concern when shooting is to make sure to build in a hinge. If we want some master coverage of the A shape, a thing that works great is to place one line straight down the center and position the master on it, and also a mirror on the other side. Cutting back and forth, both cameras are exactly centered, and each shot is a mirror of the other, which can be interesting coverage by itself. But the beauty is that just as with a close-up on the man, we can get to and from any camera in the scene from these masters. The L shape is a variation of the A shape where 2 characters are lumped together and one is further away. Given everything we've already looked at, this should be extremely easy to cover. With the main conversation being between the women, we'll put in 2 reverses. They're on this side of the line to be nearer any conversation with the man. This camera will probably be our hinge, so we'll put in an internal shot on the man on this side of the line. Let's also create an internal 2 shot on the women to mirror. When the conversation turns to the man, if the red woman is mainly doing the talking, we'll put in a close-up on her to mirror his close-up directly. If this is a short scene, we've already overcovered it, but let's top it off with an external reverse here and an external reverse here. So starting in the external reverses between the women, we're cutting back and forth since this is the main dialogue. Out in the hinge, we suddenly cut to the close-up on the man as he makes a comment. In the 2 shot on the women, they turn to him. Here we do a bit of external reverse dialogue between the 2 groups. At some point, the conversation becomes more personal between the man and the red woman, so we cut between his close-up again and her close-up. Back in this external reverse, the women stand for a bit, then again turn to each other. We cut back into the hinge. And then the reverse on that line. Back in the hinge, we cut to the man's close-up again for a silent reaction. With the L shape, let's introduce a unique way of cutting across the line. Since the L shape closely resembles the A shape, the main difference is that the dialogue centers around two characters with a third occasionally participating, in this case the blue man. With two internal reverses on the red man and woman, we'll put a third camera for the blue man out here, still on our side of the line, and a close-up on him as well. Obviously, we'll be able to cut between these three cameras, bringing in the blue man with this camera. Using that as a hinge, we can cut to the close-up, back into the hinge, and out to the reverse dialogue. That's doing it by the book, but the unique thing about this setup is that we don't need the hinge. Starting a reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll be skipping the hinge and cutting straight to the close-up on the blue man. As we cut, it makes just as much sense as it would have using a hinge, even though we're jumping the line. Cutting back into reverse dialogue, the blue man was looking at the red man, so we'll cut back to him. The reason it works is that in the close-up, we really don't know how far back we are. We could produce almost the exact same shot by being back here with a longer focal length. So even though we're jumping the main line, we don't necessarily know it. This is useful because it allows us to do close-ups on all the characters on the other side of the line. Here we're again cutting back and forth in reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, but the close-up will be on the blue woman deeper into the scene. We cut to her for a comment, but the close-up is likely to be perceived as being on our side of the line. Even if it isn't, it's close to being legal, and if we've previously established geography with a master, we'll get away with it. This technique doesn't look pretty on paper, but it works and is invaluable when we're dealing with a lot of characters. In this chapter, we'll look at the U, I, and O shapes, which are very similar and can be handled using identical techniques. The U shape has two rows of any number of characters and one center character to complete the U. If we remove the center character, we're left with two I shapes across from each other. If we bring him back and add a character at the other end of the table, we have a full circle or O shape. The main difficulty here is that we're dealing with a lot of characters, and with dialogue crisscrossing the scene, we need a way to manage what is easily a very complex scene. A thing to notice is that it's generally easier to cover the scene from inside and outwards. If these three characters are having dialogue, this creates three lines, and staying within them, we can cut back and forth as we please. As soon as we move outside and do over the shoulders, we'll be crossing lines in every cut, and we'll have to work out a plan for hinging. A second thing to notice is that with a master of the scene, getting coverage and managing lines becomes much more forgiving because the geography is fresh in our minds. And if we later find ourselves entangled in lines or have lost orientation, there's no faster way to get out than with a master, even if it means crossing a line on the way out. A third thing to notice is that doing groupings that include more than one character is much better than doing single shots on each character. Not just because we have less cameras to shoot, but because overlapping characters and scenery make spatial continuity easier to maintain. This means that even if the red man is mainly doing the talking, we frame the shot to include the extra next to him, and this will also be her shot if she has dialogue. A last thing to notice is that the dialogue is usually between very few characters and the rest function as extras. So if we remove the others, we can easily cover the scene using techniques we've already looked at. Here the dialogue centers around the man in the suit and the blue woman, with occasional comments from the others, so let's try the line-crossing L shape we looked at in the last chapter. We'll simply put in two reverses for them, a master, an insert on the blue man and the red woman, and an insert on the red man and the surrounding extras. Starting in the master, we'll cut to one reverse on the main dialogue, and the other. Then sneak across the line to this shot, and to this shot, back in reverse dialogue, and so on. Finding a shape based on the characters that really matter quickly gives structure to the coverage, and adding all other cameras according to these lines gives us more than enough to cover most scenes with. But let's look at a different technique that can handle any scene regardless of how complex it is. When the dialogue is all over the place, and no simple technique will solve it, the trick is to draw every conceivable line in the scene and then place cameras that work for as many lines as possible. This will temporarily make the diagram look overwhelming. The obvious lines come from dialogue. Here the CEO at the end of the table talks with a blue woman. He also talks with a red man, and with a red woman, who also talk with each other. At some point, the blue woman comments on something the red woman is saying. And at some point, the blue man comments on something the red man is saying, after which the CEO adds a remark. Other lines come from reactions, or from anywhere there's a tension between characters. This extra will have a reaction to something the red man says, which creates a line here. And this extra will have a reaction to something the red woman says. For the beginning of the scene where this line is active, we'll start with a wide over the shoulder on the woman, a close-up on her, and a close-up on the CEO, which we've placed like this so it'll work for dialogue with the other characters as well. For the main dialogue between the CEO and the red man and woman, which happens within this triangle, we'll add 2 more outward cameras, and all 3 will cut smoothly as long as we're inside the triangle. For the dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll also add a pair of external reverses, which we'll need to hinge in and out of because we'll be crossing these lines. For the remaining cameras, let's try to be a little wider to build an overview of the scene. While the red man is having dialogue with the red woman, the blue man makes a comment, so that camera will need to be between these 2 active lines. We'll put it far enough back to capture the CEO's comments, which follow immediately after. Again, back in the dialogue between the red man and woman, the blue woman makes a comment, and with these 2 active lines, the camera will need to be somewhere in this area. We'll again make it wide enough to also get some facial reaction from this extra, which would otherwise have been a separate shot. Finally, this extra makes a few grimaces during the conversation. And since we're coming from the red man's dialogue, we'll put a camera here on our side of both lines. If we now take out the lines, every camera is carefully placed to be as useful as possible. This staging layout is completely tailor-made to the scene, and if the dialogue were different, we'd have to reblock it. After we've cut dialogue between the CEO and the blue woman, the CEO talks to the red man, after which he talks to the red woman. The red man makes a sudden comment, and the woman turns her attention. After this, we cut between the external reverses, which shows their seating arrangements a little clearer. Now we want to get back to the CEO as he listens to their conversation, but we need to get back inside the main triangle first. The CEO listens. And over on the woman. Now the blue woman makes a comment. The red man says something to the red woman. Now the blue man injects a comment. The red man turns to him and responds. The extra in the shot from before sends a secret signal to the blue man. The red man makes another comment. The extra at the end of the table frowns. From here, the red woman makes another comment. The CEO turns to the blue woman. And on it goes. The technique of drawing all lines in the scene and picking cameras that fit with as many lines as possible allows us to cover scenes with even an absurd number of lines. The U shape is a very typical shape, but the way we covered it had more to do with the fact that we had a lot of characters. This is why if we take out the CEO and are left with a double I shape, another typical shape, the method is the same. Or if we occupy both ends of the table in an O shape. When the characters are very close together, we have no choice but to cover them from outside the action. What we'll look at here applies equally well to any shape, but will work with the O shape because it's completely enclosed. If we removed one character, it would be a U shape, and we would have a much easier time getting inside the dialogue, maybe starting with a master here. The simplest way to cover this is to select only 1, maybe 2 lines, and arrange all cameras according to them. Here we'll decide that the main dialogue is between the man in the suit and the red woman. So we'll put in and over the shoulder, a close-up, and a reverse close-up. We'll cover the rest of the scene as pivots on the man in the suit. For a shot on the blue characters, we'll do an over-the-shoulder 3-shot. For a shot on the red man, we'll do an over-the-shoulder. If we want some more close-ups, we can just keep adding cameras. We'll find out in editing whether or not we need to hinge in and out of this camera. All of these cameras will cut fine together, but it could be a problem cutting between these two cameras in the reverse 3-shot. Starting in the first over the shoulder, we'll cut close on the red woman. The red man inserts a comment. We go to the internal reverse on the man in the suit. Cutting to the 3-shot, we're twisting a little too much. So let's go back to the internal reverse. Cut to the over the shoulder, and then the 3-shot. We'll now use the close-up on the blue woman, again the close-up on the red woman, the over the shoulder on the red man, and so on. By picking one line, we're able to cover most of the scene from the outside and go inside on the same side of the line to get any extra close-ups. Probably the hardest situation to get an overview of is when characters are scattered all over the scene. The first thing to notice about this is that we'd be much better off by rearranging the characters so they wouldn't be as scattered. But assuming that they have to be exactly where they are now, our goal again is to create as few lines as possible. First, we'll consolidate all characters close to each other and treat them as one character, so for line purposes, these two will be one character, and so will these two. Secondly, we want to find the center of the scene as soon as possible. In this scene, the main dialogue is between these three characters, so that's an A shape we can cover outward from the center. If we have more specific dialogue between the red man and the man in the suit, we'll also put in two external reverses, which we'll need to hinge in and out of. In order to cover the red woman, let's treat this as an L shape and sneak over the line to get a close-up. To cover the blue woman, let's also treat this as an L shape and again sneak over the line for a close-up. That covers it, but the spatial continuity can be a little questionable because almost every shot is a close-up. What we'll do about that is first of all create overlapping groups. These three characters make up an I shape, so we'll make sure to frame this over the shoulder to include the woman in the background. We'll also frame the close-up on the red man to more fully include her in the background. Additionally, let's create a new shot on the red man that includes the blue woman in the background, which should be easy to get in and out of. Finally, let's create a master, which we're doing last in order to position it to get easily into the first close-up. This will be the first close-up, so we'll place the master here. If we had placed the master here, we would cut across a line no matter which camera we went to afterwards. So starting in the master, we cut to the close-up on the man in the suit, the external reverse on the red man, the external reverse on the man in the suit, and the close-up on the red man. To bring in the blue woman, the first shot on her includes the red man in the foreground. The man in the suit turns to her, and for this dialogue we use the close-up on her. Back on the original line, let's experiment with using the L shape to sneak over the line. As we cut to the man in the suit, the original line is clearly active, but this is where cutting across to the blue woman works just as well. The red man turns to the blue man, and we cut to the shot on him for the first time. As we go back and forth, the line is clearly between them. But even so, we can sneak over the line to the close-up on the red woman. Getting back works just as easily.